I am an Australian. I have worked over there for some years, and I work in rumen function, particularly in system development. So this area of fibre is something I've been in a long time now, and I am going to challenge your thinking around fibre on pasture in particular, to a lesser extent crops, and do a little bit on grain feeding as well. So this is what we're really talking about. We are going to talk about grain and feeding out grain on pasture and in feedlots, but we really are talking about pasture because that's where most of the chatter around fibre in systems really comes up. And what I want to do is talk to you about fibre requirements in general, how we came up with them, what the background was, which is pretty important, and then to talk to you about some alternative explanations to fibre deficiency, which is something that you hear all along. Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit of history on this because this is pretty important. So the concept of fibre as a nutritional assay has been from the late 19th century. And it was crude fibre, so it was a blunt tool, and it was really everything that was indigestible in the feed. Now, that time there wasn't too much known about it. It followed a little after that, in that sort of golden period of ruminant nutrition after the Second World War, that people began to look very specifically at rumen function and what was involved in good and bad rumen function. And amongst the many things that came out of that work was that there was a non-nutritional role for fibre, if you like, and that fibre physically moved something in the rumen and caused a few changes, but the most important change, and the one most of you would have heard about, it would change rumen motility. There's two things to remember about this. It was nearly all done by the British, and it was nearly all done in sheep. So at this stage, it was all sheep models that people were working through, and some of the very good work that was done early was exclusively on sheep models. Crude fibre was hard and it wasn't easy to use, hard to measure and wasn't easy to use. So in the 1960s, a guy who worked for the US Department of Ag and Penn State University, called Van Soest, he came up with a better method, a much more accurate method of chemically measuring the fibre. And that's the method that we all use today, which is neutral detergent fibre. But there's a difficulty with this. It was a chemical measurement of the fibre, but it said nothing about this non-nutritional role. Because I could take that feed that had X% of NDF and I could grind it to a fine powder and it would have no effect at all as a fibre in the rumen. So the size was obviously important. So the next extension of this understanding of fibre came over the next 30 years or so. And what people did then was say, well, I need some other measure that's a non-chemical measure, a non-proximate measure of fibre to work out what's enough fibre or not enough. And out of that loosely came this concept of effective fibre. Now I want to say 2 points on that. It was 100% dairy cows. So it was all cattle and it was all dairy. So this was a very different approach to what the British had taken. Effective fibre was always done on two parameters. Number one, I can look over the fence and see rumination. So rumination was one measure, and I can get milk out of these animals without much trouble at scale, and I can get milk fat. And for various reasons that we won't go into much today, milk fat is a pretty sensitive indicator of good and poor rumen function. If you have poor rumen function, particularly around the amount of fibre in it, milk fat tends to fall. So you can use it as a pretty sensitive indicator. So effective fibre took off and the concept took off, but there was a problem. If you handed me that sample, I couldn't measure it for you. The only way that I could measure effective fibre was by feeding it to dairy cows, getting their milk fat and watching their rumination, and that didn't help people. The genius work was a guy called Mertens in 1997, and Mertens married the two concepts here. So what he did, he said, well, we can use this chemical NDF measure, and that's a very accurate measure. You can do it repeatedly on any samples you give me, but I need to have some way also of physically measuring some quality of that feed that gives me an indication of whether it was effective or not. So what he did, he reached back to an Australian worker who happened to be my mentor. Dennis Poppy is a Queenslander, and Dennis is the Elvis Presley of ruminant nutrition. Right, everybody else stands in his shadow. And this was right back at the beginning of his career. And what he had shown through this was what size, and this was sheep work, what size particles don't leave the rumen. So what size particles stay in the rumen? And he'd come up with this figure on the sieves of 1.18. And that's the figure that Mertens reached back for. And he looked at that and said, well, if it stays in the rumen, then it causes them to chew. So as a consequence of that, that could be the figure that we use. And that could be the size that we use. And he did. So just so you're clear on how it works, what it is, it's the marriage between the chemical definition of this NDF, which is no effective help to me at all, and what's effective or not in the animal. He did it by merging a whole lot of studies, some hundreds of studies to merge together. And what he said was, I could have this level, and we use this example here of 65% NDF, and let me say that 3/4 of it, or 75%, stays above that 1.18 mil screen. I marry those two figures together, I have a PE, or physically effective NDF. Now, most of you, when you've read about NDF or effective fibre diets, that's what folk will be talking about. What's physically effective on this? Now, the system worked really well, but here's the point with it. It was all done on total mixed rations, and it was all done on dairy cows, exclusively. No in-betweens on this. All of it was done on total mixed rations. Now, if you hand me a total mixed ration, you can think about it conceptually. Without much trouble, you've got an amalgam of feeds. You've got all sorts of feeds. Some are broken up, some are chopped up. There's small bits, there's large bits. You can shake that through your sieves and you can come up with a percentage, a dry percentage of that works reasonably well. We'd agree on that. But what if I move to pasture? So here is the first T intersection where we run into trouble. So while this concept was pretty good, the difficulty was, what do I do if I move past it? Two things that we can look at that make it easy and give you a figure that you can remember and fix in your head. Note down the bottom that 20% physically effective fibre. Okay, so this is an amalgam. This is out of Merton's paper. So this is an amalgam for this. Note there. Now, that level of milk fat that he selected was, there's a good consensus around that being effective rumen function. In other words, if I have that sort of milk fat, I'm not short on fibre. So he just did this as a simple curve. What's the level of physically effective NDF that I really need to have if I want to keep it going in dairy cows? And that's that. Another way to look at that, which is a similar one for him to do, was to use, instead of the milk fat, to use rumen pH. You note slightly different studies and smaller studies on this, but the same concept and a very similar curve. And lo and behold, if you look at 20 and you track that up, the general consensus around good and bad rumen pH, particularly on TMR diets, is above 5.8, so somewhere in that 5.8 to 6 pH. So you can see there's some confidence using those diets and a lot of studies in saying if you had 20% physically effective NDF, you're in the ballpark. And that's exactly what Merton's did. But I'll give you my question again, how do I apply that to pasture? And something else comes into play. Straight away, after poppy, some people had made another point. Another couple of Australians, they said, well, actually, if you take those big pieces that are in the rumen and you see how long they stay in the rumen, and you can do that experimentally, they stay in there for 3 days. Now, I've taken some liberty with that data, but you'll have to trust me on that. They stay in there for about 3 days. Now, sometime later, that was picked up again in a different series and said, actually, if I take the original ones, all of those original ones stay there a bit longer, which I can live with, but the larger of those original particle sizes also stay there around about 2 days. So it does depend what type of fibre you're dealing with, but I don't want to dwell on the details there. I want to say this. If you go over that limit of physically effective NDF, you have to accept, like night follows day, that that material that's eaten there will stay in the rumen. Now, I'll put this another way for you. If you are to feed 500 grams of straw, after 3 days in that rumen, you don't have 500 grams of straw. You have 1.5 kilograms of straw with some losses. Are we clear on that one? Because before we march any further on that one, you all need to get that one. What this showed was that those larger particle sizes will stay there for a time. So there's a net effect of feeding that fibre, and it's down the bottom. I increase the rumen fill, I decrease the intake, and on top of that, I've diluted out the ME value of my diet. That straw was an ME of 8, my pasture is an ME of 11 or 12. What I eat here, I don't eat here. And more, actually, but we're not going to go into that. So either way, I've diluted out the ME of that. So there's no advantage in me going over that physically effective fibre limit, if indeed that physically effective fibre limit was the same for sheep that it was for dairy cows. Preston and Lang are another couple of Australians, University of New England, and a lot of you would have known them. And I put this there, if you note the date, so this is not long after poppy. So these people were close, if you like, they were close to when this was all happening. So when they listed their priorities, number 4, I put up in bold for you. I would suggest to you, if I had the number of people who speak into nutrition today to list their priorities, where do you think it would be? Probably number 2. It might fit in just a little bit under energy, it might slip to 3 under there, but either way it would be right up the list on it. It's achieved the priority that it probably doesn't deserve. And that's where I want to spend the rest of this time on. Now, our pasture again. So we're going to move off a TMR diet, and I've got this pasture. So here's an easy concept for you. These sieves are about that round. They're very neat and tidy, and the sizes are all the same. I take pasture, so I'm just going to take that pasture sample, and I'm going to take it in mouthfuls just the same way that a sheep would. How many of you believe that when I put fill up that sieve on the top, how many of you believe that anything will drop through 1.18 mil with a pasture? Absolutely nothing will drop through. So different to the total mixed ration that we said was broken up and had small pieces, and it won't. In pastures it won't. So there's no way that we can go back and do that measurement that we did before, have a chemical NDF and have an effective size distribution on this. You can't do it. So what do you do if you can't do it? You guess. You guess. And that's what people did. Now, the best of the New Zealand ruminant nutritionists, in my humble opinion, is Eric Culver. Now, Eric looked at this specifically. He's a real pasture man. And what he said was, depending on how you went about this, the best guess for what the effective component of NDF that was in these diets, specifically in these pasture diets, and I should add for this one, was somewhere between 29 and 78%. I want to put it to you another way. When you have a range of 29 to 78%, the conversation is over. The conversation's over. I'd do better flipping a coin than putting that sort of up there. Right, number one. Number two, even if I wanted to have a middle portion on this one, so let me take 50 or 60% as a middle portion. In my opinion, it's higher than that. For various reasons that we won't get time to speak today, it's higher. I suspect it was much closer to the very high end of this. Some years ago, we did pasture assessments at point of grazing. We had 70 farms every month for years. We collected thousands of these samples. It was very interesting to me. Number one, the South Island of New Zealand too. So high quality pastures, some irrigated, some not, but all really highly managed pastures. And it was very interesting. They were all stunningly similar across the year, and they were all very, very high quality in the scheme of things. But what was most interesting, so you can see there the crude protein was high, the ME was high, they were good quality pastures. But what was most interesting, it was very hard to find pastures under 35. So when I arrived in New Zealand, like there is in Australia, there's this sort of myth, I'll call it, about the fibreless grass, that there's no fibre in this grass and you can't find it. Well, the first years I thought, no, I'm not looking hard enough, and I hunted pretty hard for it. And then I realised after a few years it's like the Yeti. Everybody's seen it until you ask them for a photo and no one can tell you about it. They just don't exist. It was stunningly rare to get NDF that was ever under 35. In fact, the average on these incredibly highly managed pastures was about 37 or 38. So I guess my point is, if we take that 35 or 40 and we use our 60% again, I want to go back to that physically effective threshold of 20%. You can see we're already there. We're already there. So I have a question for you around, which we're going to turn to in a minute, around the grass. If we move to a lamb system, most of us agree on ryegrass, for example. Our lamb systems, that sweet spot is in there. Costs you money if you get over that 1,500 on them. You really have to keep it there. Is there anybody who believes, and you're welcome to, right? Is there anybody who believes that at that sort of pasture management approach that you actually get higher NDF? No. You don't. You'll have lower NDF. So these systems are there, these highly productive systems, of which there's a lot of data showing the advantages of rolling to them on live weight gain, etc., all of which are going to have a low dry matter, high crude protein, and for that matter, not a spectacularly high NDF. Probably in that bracket most of the time of 35 to 40. The classic response to this is to say, if I'm going to increase the fibre, then I'm going to put something out and it'll be a long chop out, so either hay or some rougher baleage or silage or on an occasion straw. We don't get that much anymore, but in some of the areas with straw that was often used. So I want to say a couple of things that we can be certain that it does. So the first two we can be certain that it does. So the first one is, I said to you before, you can't defy gravity. If you put those indigestible particles in the rumen, they stay in the rumen. And if they're in the rumen, something else is not in the rumen. So the first one is, if you use them, you immediately reduce intake. So that if you add that to it, you reduce their intake. The second one follows on that. It's always going to be a lower ME. So even if I kept the same intake, I've reduced their ME intake for the period, but I've double reduced their ME intake for this because decreased their intake in dry matter, and I've decreased it in ME per dry matter. I'm not winning on that. Usually, what will happen immediately is you reduce production. Very easy to find in dairy because you get it day by day. A little harder to get in live weight gains. So the red meat industries it's a little bit more to demonstrate this. The information's there. And then the final one, you'll pay for that supplement and you lose that production on them. So either way, you reduce your profit. I'm going to come back to this right at the end. And I want to go to my word, I'm going to say a little bit about grain feeding. So the first one is there are different drivers in grain feeding. If anyone wants this paper, I'll give it to you after about feeding sheep with grains. But this is taken out of this paper. But what I want to draw your attention to is one simple bit. If you move between different cereal grains, you can see that there's a wide variety of NDFs that are represented there. Some are higher, some are lower. But if you pick barley for a good example, it's reasonably high. It's not that low, it's reasonably high. Okay? But the particle size on it is smaller. Two types of grain feeding, which we haven't got time to say an awful lot about, but in one, there's a supplementary feeding that happens as an adjunct to pasture use. And in those cases, there's good information, a lot of it actually from Australia, further north of you here, but from Australia, looking at what the minimum amount of roughage that's required if you're feeding standard, and usually these aren't production feeding situations at their hard edge, they're survival situations, but what's the minimum amount of roughage if you're using those grains? And in short, the minimum amount of roughage can be very small. And even when you're using at 75% of the ME intake of a dry ewe, so you're still up there at 7 ME or so intake for it, the amount of roughage that's required in that, really required in that, for normal function to continue is relatively small. So again, even in grains with a smaller particle size, the fibre requirements can be wildly overestimated. And they're often talked about well higher than what the literature has supported. The second component is lot feeding. There's a very different dynamic in lot feeding in terms of adaptation to feeds and a whole series of rumen changes after it. But there is a short summary underneath it. It'll generally bat in that bracket between 10 and 30% for roughages, there or thereabouts in that bracket. And as a consequence of that, and that depends a little bit on what the roughage is, but as a consequence of that, you can take the bottom end of that. 10% is 90% non. Now, going back to what we said before with those NDFs, if you sort of roll through the maths on that, again, you can see the NDF value for the total diet is nothing like what is often put out there as normal for these animals to achieve function. So I want to return this. I should have mentioned that too. So the two things we said before, from that, although there are different drivers on it, if it is a lot feeding situation, I am actually supplying particle size. I'm not in the pasture situation, but I am in the lot feeding situation where there often be, or sometimes none at all, no pasture at all. I am supplying that. If we're going to talk about these hard charging pastures particularly though, to return to this, what might be another explanation for what's loosely termed this fibre deficiency? And the one that we spend a lot of time on and have for some years is low dry matter feeds. And so there's a couple of things that happen with this. The first one is, I think people underestimate how much water is eaten when you're achieving normal dry matter intakes on low dry matter feeds. And I'm going to show you that in a second. But the second and third points are probably the ones that I want to talk about here and then leave. There's a very different rumen passage rate if you've got a high water loading that's coming in. You encourage a very fast rumen passage rate, or at least a component of that, the fluid rate. You encourage that and you have to deal with that. And in general terms, it's a positive. It's a positive for protein nutrition, for example. It's a positive for many others. It's not a negative. That's what I want you to take away. It's not automatically a negative. What is a negative on occasion is that there's an adaptation that occurs over a period of time. And if you're moving from a higher to a lower dry matter, there are some things that have to shift. And some of them take longer than people give them credit for. And while they're not shifting, you often do end up with more fecal water. So that's water that hasn't actually left the gut. Okay? I want to give you an example of this. We'll just use a 65 kilo ewe. Let's put 3.5% of her live weight in dry matter day, so not the highest end we could have, but quite up there. This is just a good example to use. So that's 2.5 kilos of dry matter intake. Let's say that pasture is at 15%. What that really means is she's got to eat more than 16 kilograms of wet weight to get that. Another way to put it is she's eaten about 14 litres of water. Now, if she's got a high urine outflow, or 60 mils a kilogram live weight, that's about 4 litres. So you can see there's a lot of water there to go elsewhere. I'll give you a feeling for that. Her blood volume is about 8% of what she weighs. So let's say 5 litres. So that's a couple of blood volumes, more or less there, that have to be dealt with. In other words, there's a limit to how much will leave that tract. And that's what doesn't leave that tract will keep going and come out the other end. Now, what if I change that a little bit and make it 12%, which we get all the time, 12% dry matter in those pastures. That's at 20 kilograms of wet weight, and I've got 17 litres of water eaten. You can see the same figures would hold for that. There's an awful lot of water there that's making its way somewhere. So some years ago, we did exactly this, looking through various bits and pieces. Does this water flow change if you have a very high water load or a lowish one? And Mr. Chairman, I'll be finishing up soon. Does it change if you have this? And in short, there's an upper limit to what that rumen passage rate will rise to. It'll increase and then it'll stop at a certain point and they'll take other water out, and then after that the intake will begin to slow down. But that's quite a high level, above what you would normally achieve. And in short, they are all positives for protein nutrition, not negatives. I hear it said occasionally it's a negative for protein, they can't absorb it, they don't get it in the rumen. Actually, none of that's true. They're positives in terms of rumen microbial protein, and they're positives in terms of protein nutrition generally. What about minerals? Do these fast passage rates cane the calcium, for example? Well, no. Most of calcium's absorbed in the upper small intestine, there or thereabouts. So having fast passage rates in the rumen doesn't affect that. There isn't any great change. There's not a shred of evidence to show bioavailability of calcium moves with that. Again, one of those things that's sort of been plucked from nowhere. How do we comment on some of this? So what we do to comment on some of this is some highly specific experiments using sheep. So we could put backpacks on them and carry various data loggers that they can run around on pastures while they're lactating. Yep. And on top of that, they have fistulas in various places, some in the rumen and some in the cannula, some in the abomasal cannula as well. So from these, we can measure in and out and water various flows. After years of doing this, I want to say pretty plainly, if I had one thing to say to you, there is no problem here. These really highly managed pastures at very high intakes, twin lactating ewes, there are no parameters in the rumen that show to be a problem. And because I'm conscious of time, I'm going to finish on this one. A couple of bits I'd say. Your pastures, particularly in southern Victoria, you have hotter nighttime temperatures, higher NDF. You're unlikely ever to be fibre deficient on those pastures in general terms. The second one is you put fibre in there, you are not increasing your intake. In fact, to the contrary, you're decreasing your intake and you're spending your money. In fact, we have a saying for it in New Zealand: whenever you're tempted to feed those roughages, go and buy a yacht, right? Because it's cheaper. It'll be cheaper for you in the long run to buy a yacht, make no mistake about it, and it's better for the sheep. And the final one would be that grain feeding systems have some different drivers around that one there. And there's a little bit more to be said, but in some cases it is long fibre to be done. And that, Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it over. If you have all that water roaring through them, there's a limit to how much of that water will be taken up from the gut. Yeah. So particularly in high water intakes. And if there was a focal example to fix your eyes on, the best one I can think of is some of the sort of 7,000 litre cows, dairy cows, on hot grass. So only pasture systems. They get nothing else but pasture. They'll have liquid faeces 365 days a year. Perfectly sound, high production, reproductively able, non-lame. There can be very little argument that there's something going wrong, but they'll have fecal slurry 365 days a year. And the rationale behind it is that a lot of that fecal water just has come through the gut. It's not been absorbed. It's not necessarily that it's a hindgut or a rumen dysfunction causing a hindgut problem, which is what people often talk about. So as you mentioned there, the idea is slowing the rumen down. Think of it like this. If I've got an aquarium full of green fluid and I pull the plug, all that will drain out. Now, if I screw up some bird wire and put it in the aquarium and I pull the plug, do you reckon that'll stop it from draining out? No. It'll go out around it just like it did before. It's the water load. What it does, not slowing the rumen down, is if I feed, for sheep for example, if I feed 500 grams of grain, which is very dry, I take 4 or 5 litres out of the diet of water that's eaten. Now, you've got to ask the question then, did that 4 or 5 litres, did it cause a problem? I would argue no. DAGs are a separate issue to one side, and you need to be cautious with that, but in general terms, no. So the idea with fibre on pastures is fixing a problem that doesn't exist. When you move them between diets of different dry matters, there is a changeover period for up to 2 weeks. That's true. But after they've adapted for that, they'll often still have high fecal water.
during the recent drought, I've fed my ewes about 3 to 4 kilos a week of F3 barley with great success, maintaining that scored 2 condition. Was there any need for anything else?
Well, they presumably had a pasture base under that though, didn't they?
Oh, very minimal. Wasn't much around.
Well, when you say minimal, like was we putting up there before, it's about 50 grams a day is the minimum that you can run to. No.
They did fantastic.
And no requirement. In fact, some of the northern hard press systems end up having 100% grain, and they're on effectively the concrete under our feet. So you can transition them onto that, not to be encouraged, but you can transition them onto it. So I suggest to you, no, you wouldn't need it.